Welcome to A Region of Solutions, the ESCAP podcast where we explore ideas and partnerships driving change in Asia and the Pacific. I'm Kavita, Sukanandan. In this episode, we are diving into one of the most pressing challenges of our time: how to mobilize climate finance at scale. The region needs trillions of dollars in investment to transition to clean energy, build resilience, and meet climate goals. But how do we unlock those resources and make them work where they're needed the most? We're joined today by two colleagues from ESCAP's Financing for Development section, Deanna and Pierre, who are leading exciting initiatives in the climate finance area. Together, we'll explore how innovative finance can turn climate ambition into concrete action across the region. So welcome, Pierre and Deanna. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Pleasure being here.
So we always like to break the ice by getting you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to working on this field.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm Deanna Morris. I'm an Economic Affairs Officer. I'm leading some of our work on banking sector and climate market development.
This is Pierre Horna. I'm also an Economic Affairs Officer, leading currently the energy transition financing workstream here at ESCAP.
So one of the common questions we ask on every episode is, what solutions are you working on for the region?
We are always trying to unlock finance for clean energy by strengthening policy, de-risking investments, and supporting innovative tools like blended finance, carbon markets, within carbon markets, transition credit frameworks, and regional power connectivity. Our aim at the end of the day as a regional commission is to help countries to reduce their dependence on coal while ensuring energy access, affordability, and resilience.
I want to highlight one of the solutions that I'm quite particularly excited about right now, and that's our work on sustainable capital markets. Right now, we're working with governments like Cambodia to support sovereign sustainable bond issuances. And what is a sustainable bond issuance? For those of you who don't know, it's a capital market instrument that helps attract capital specifically for green or social projects. And this is in contrast a bit to traditional government bond issuances, which is typically used to raise funds for general budgetary needs. So this is a bit more specific on SDG-aligned needs or financing. And in addition, we're working with securities exchange regulators to expand and grow countries' bond markets in ways that channel investments towards the SDGs. So over the course of our work, particularly in Cambodia, we've seen bond markets grow from just around $200 million to around $400 million. And I'm really proud to say that our support has played a meaningful role in this process. In fact, the issuances that we've helped facilitate account for about 30% of the overall market growth. And I think that demonstrates really how targeted technical assistance and partnerships can translate into real measurable results on the ground, like what Pierre was saying about energy transition.
Following the example of Cambodia, you've seen also in other countries like Indonesia and Vietnam, as well as the Philippines, where some key projects have actually secured finance from the issuing of green bonds. And in some ways, they have also done it without necessarily the involvement of development finance institutions or export credit agencies to cover the risks, meaning that they are actually learning quite a lot in some of these emerging markets. And moving forward on this, it's also the way in which governments are slowly understanding, I think very much faster than we even imagine, how important is enabling policies to secure finance for the energy transition.
That's some very interesting initiatives that you have broadly mentioned, but why is mobilizing climate finance such a challenge in the region? What makes it so urgent right now?
This is a very timely question, Kavita, because our team just published our Financing for Development report. It's called A Call to Action, Developing Sustainable Capital Markets, Financing Energy Transitions, and Building Project Pipelines. You can download that online. Both Pierre and me authored chapters of this that actually address the exact question that you've just asked. As many of us know, the developing countries in the Asia-Pacific region need between $2.5 to $4 trillion annually to meet the SDGs. And in addition to this, to meet the region's climate commitments, we also need about $3.3 trillion to $4.9 trillion by 2030. These are huge capital amounts that are needed. The Asia-Pacific region is also the most disaster-prone region, and also many of the developing countries are facing high levels of debt distress. So collectively, you see there's a lot of challenges faced by the region right now.
We've worked a lot on also trying to understand from the point of view of the energy sector what is happening there, particularly in terms of the finance that is needed to transitioning from fossil fuel to renewable energy power generation projects. And in this regard, this ESCAP report that Deanna mentioned talks about structural barriers. What are the structural barriers? Heavy coal dependence, high investment risks, policy and regulatory uncertainty, market distortions from subsidies, which is extremely massive in some countries in the region, underdeveloped capital markets, limited concessional finance, and of course, the problem in particular in the energy sector is that there is a soaring energy demand, which accounts for 40% of the global energy demand in 2023. Southeast Asia being a quarter of global demand growth through until 2035. Of course, without clean investment, this demand risk being locked into fossil fuels. All in all, the bottom line is that mobilizing climate finance in Asia Pacific is a high-stakes challenge. Unless its capital urgently redirected, region is locking itself into decades of coal dependency, undermining both climate goals and long-term energy security.
That sounds very fascinating indeed. Our podcast tends to have a very wide public audience who some of them might be thinking right now, I'm not a government official, I don't work in the energy or climate sectors. Why should I care about climate finance?
I would say it's critically important because some of the work that we're doing in Mongolia is a very good example of this. We've done modeling with the Bank of Mongolia, looking at what are the climate impacts to the economy over the next 3 decades. And I have to say the figures are quite staggering. Negative GDP growth across different climate scenarios. And of course, as we know, we're only able to do analysis based on the past events. We don't know what the future holds. And as we see, climate disasters are increasing in intensity and increasing in frequency as well. The past analysis that we've done based on past events is actually accelerating, and the analysis that we have already shows negative GDP growth across the next few decades. That's not necessarily a great indicator because it's based on past, not future events. And this then really shows that there are significant challenges for economies generally, not only the cost of human lives, but also the cost of economic impacts, inflationary impacts, and price stability impacts as well. So it is a concern, I think, not only for us as governments, but also as individuals.
Perhaps just to complement Deanna's response, it is true that climate finance is not just about clean energy, but it's also protecting jobs and supporting development. The problem is that in many of the energy projects that we have seen in the region is that some of these considerations are not just considered, so to speak, at the outset of these transactions. This is extremely important from the case of the energy that the Asia-Pacific region will consume nearly half of the world energy and generates about 45% of electricity from coal, hosting 79% of all operating coal plants worldwide. Therefore, the issue of retiring coal plants in the region becomes a critical point.
Pierre, so what are some of the biggest hurdles? Is it policy? Is it market? Is it perception that's holding back private and public investment in climate projects?
I think it's the $1 million question that always it's on the top of policymakers and also project developers. There is a lot of resistance from public and private investors in how to address these hurdles. One of the big areas that we are working is to address the issue of persistent policy uncertainty. And it is true that while many countries have pledged net zero by 2050, few have set clear interim targets of sectoral milestones for 2030 or 2040.
Some of the countries that we work with don't have net zero targets. Some of them do. But now, as we know, the new round of NDCs, that's the nationally determined contributions, are coming out this year. They were actually already due, but some countries are working towards COP to be able to have those nationally determined contributions out. And what those are the targets set by countries to achieve specific targets for decarbonization under the Paris Agreement.
Those are definitely some key steps that you've outlined there, Deanna, to scale up climate finance. Just curious, have there been any standout initiatives coming from the region that you have gone, wow, I didn't see that coming, but this is just what we need to build momentum on?
One is one of the biggest float and solar projects in Indonesia. is about to create 145 megawatts of floating solar generation. This financial structure was secured from commercial banks, notably international ones from different parts of the world. And the financing was fully uncovered long-term loans from commercial banks without involvement of DFIs. The facility was about 112 million with a tenor of 16 years. And a key feature of that project is that it's a structure with as an IPP, which is independent power producer, working with utilities. In this case, in Indonesia, the utilities are handled by state utility, and the majority of the project management of the work is done by this utility entity, PLN, and it was a solid PPA of a 25-year tenure. So actually, what stand out is that first, the commercial bank risk was accepted. They managed a long-term commercial bank financing without guarantees, backing from DFIs, which is something innovative. Second, the structuring of the project using floating solar reduces land use uses, as you know, and also it doesn't warm up so much the generation of the power of the PV. And of course, that is also very important because it can improve power generation yield in so many ways. The engineering, regulatory environment, and social were also very important and require careful negotiation. But of course, project developers were actually fully, let's say, supported by those commercial banks as well.
So maybe just picking up on that, not having any guarantee in place. And this is a challenge that we actually see across not only energy projects, but all climate finance projects in the region of, the bankability and having to have guarantees in place because investors are requesting that. So I think that was a really good example of really seeing where, it is bankable, guarantees were not required. I want to step away from that example and maybe move into one that we're working at ESCAP. It's called the Cambodia Sustainable Bond Accelerator. And I mentioned a bit earlier about the work that we are doing in Cambodia. This accelerator was actually developed with partnership from the Securities Exchange Regulator of Cambodia, also the Global Green Growth Institute, and then several guarantors, the Credit Guarantee and Investment Facility, and the GuarantCo. And we've just recently had the Credit Guarantee Corporation of Cambodia join us as well, which is a local credit guarantor. And what we aim to do through this program, we're actually in our third phase now, so it's been going on for a few years. And what we do is we support bond issuers in preparing their green or sustainability bond issuance. These types of bond issuances have additional steps, and those additional steps take additional time, take additional expertise, and also take additional money and cost. We try to handhold and support issuers in the process. A lot of them are first-time bond issuers. They're also first-time green or sustainable bond issuers. We provide them technical assistance in developing something called a bond framework. It's essentially a document that aligns with international best practices. It's something called ICMA, International Capital Markets Association, and they have a range of different principles on how you're supposed to undertake and articulate this green bond framework, and also report on that and many other steps within this. So we help prepare that framework with the issuer. What we also do is we finance something called a second party opinion. And a second party opinion is, the easy way to describe it is kind of like an audit. So we co-finance that to make it a bit more affordable for first-time issuers, and also to ensure the transparency, which is key. And this is the whole purpose, to ensure transparency and reduce greenwashing or social washing. We've been doing this in Cambodia for the last few years. We've supported 2 green bond issuances. The first one was $10 million and the second was $50 million. And now we currently have a pipeline of an additional $90 million yet to be issued. And the current bonds are set to reduce carbon emissions. We've been able to calculate this at 86,000 megaton carbon equivalent. We've directly contributed to Cambodia's climate commitments, and it will also create 130 green jobs, particularly through the development of a 60 megawatt solar plant.
Give outlines very beautifully some small wins and big wins that are happening in the region when it comes to climate finance. Perhaps to just switch to a little bit of a lighthearted note, there are many moving parts from what I hear in this work that you're doing. What motivates you daily to come in and do the work that you do?
For me, it's always been about impact. That's why I joined the UN. I could work in a private sector organization, and it's about the bottom line. And at the end of the day, here at the UN and in our work, we see impact, not only through policy change. This year we were trying to do some assessments on how many policy changes we've supported, and it's been many. That's very nice to see, and it also takes a lot of work to see policy changes. It can take a few years sometimes, but we've seen some policy changes happen quite rapidly, and I think this is due to the challenges that the region is facing, for one. And then secondly, impact in terms of things on the ground. We are seeing concrete pipelines being developed, financing being raised, and also, as I mentioned, these green jobs being developed.
I've been part of the UN for many years already, 22 years, and I always seen that the UN can make a difference in many respects because we build bridges, and it is something that's happening all the time, whether or not it is intended or unintended purpose. When we talk to politicians, when we talk to technical people, when we talk to private sector, we are always the most inclusive platform as the United Nations Secretariat and the United Nations officers working on this area. The more we are engaged with stakeholders, whether they are public or private, the more we can actually have concrete outcomes and tangible results. And just to say a small example, it's not only about concrete MOUs or nice statements from member states, but also when it comes to the human element of it, in terms of getting to know all these government officials that are struggling on a day-to-day basis on how to deal with all these complexities, for example. So there's always silos created in ministries, and that's one of the areas that ESCAP is trying to create dialogues, task forces, coordination frameworks to streamline permitting processes for those that are interested to invest in these countries on renewable energy.
Well, there is definitely an interesting point, Pierre, that you made, and it's true. A human element does underpin almost every single work that we do here at the UN, whether it's building bridges in communities and the governments. Before we wrap up, what would you like our listeners to take away from today's conversation when it comes to climate finance?
On my side, I would say the big takeaway is that climate finance isn't abstract. It's already helping countries like Cambodia create jobs, cut emissions, and build resilience. And with the right partnerships and financing mechanisms in place, I think that we can really scale the impact across the region. And I'm very hopeful about that.
We need to always be optimistic as to how we can contribute, to particularly those emerging and development economies in Asia Pacific, where are suffering the most in this type of flow of investments that are needed, particularly in my area of work, which is energy transition. Because without closing this gap, a just, equal energy transition won't ever happen.
Thank you both for joining us today on this episode and breaking down this complex work on climate finance for our wider listeners. It has been so insightful just to hear from your perspectives and expertise. That's all for today's episode of A Region of Solutions. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and be part of the solution for our region.